Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Reece Smith. I work for Janet. I'm the technical architect for our trust and identity services. And today, I'm going to be talking about privacy and access management. I'll be telling you a quick story in 3 parts. I'll be telling you about what we're trying to do, where we are now, and where we're going. But before I get on with my story, quick prologue. What's Janet? So I work for Janet. Janet is a part of GCHQ in the UK. We are a not-for-profit company that runs the National Research and Education Network, so just like I2 over here. So super fast network and services on top of it. So that includes lots of things like video conferencing and all the usual things you do, but also a little portfolio of trust and identity services, which our customer base is about 18 million people, everyone in any kind of education in the whole of the UK. So pretty big customer base. Who's this talk aimed at? If you are not familiar with the AIM area, then it's kind of a quick overview of what bits of the AIM area are. So AIM is access and identity management, or trust and identity. If you know one particular area, if you know the world of SAML, if you know the world of Eduroam, then it's a bit of an overview of the other bits that maybe you haven't had much experience with. If you're going to be going and setting up your own federation, this might give you a bit of a understanding of the privacy implications of how you design your infrastructure. And for everyone, just to give you a chance to see where we're heading in the future if you're not involved in the development of this stuff. So where we're going in the next few years and beyond. So, onto the story. Part 1 of the story is, what do we want and why do we want it? So, bit of context. Individual privacy is heavily under attack at the moment. I think it's hard to dispute that in the era of Snowden and mass surveillance and all the other good stuff that's in the news pretty much every day for the last year or so. Of course, the question that begs is, do people actually care? And the answer seems to be not really. There's not a huge amount of backlash about mass surveillance. There's a lot of antipathy towards this thing. The problem is, the majority of people out there aren't really equipped to understand this stuff. And why should they? This is really quite technological stuff. Most people aren't just able to understand. And it's up to people like us to help them. And I care. I care about my own privacy. I care about my users' privacy. I care about all of my students who are trying to learn, their privacy. I care about all of our researchers, their privacy. So there are kind of 2 facets to this argument. One is every little helps. We should be retaining privacy wherever we can, because every little bit does help. Every bit of privacy protection you do does help. The other interesting thing is actually, out in the real world, users give away information all the time. This is one of the reasons why people say people don't care about privacy. People go and stick stuff on Facebook all the time, put on Twitter where they are, check into Foursquare. I do some of these things. Because the interesting thing is that's not particularly high assurance data. If you go on Facebook, a guy I've been working with for a few years is marked as my granddaughter on Facebook. I can't remember why. I think we were in the pub at some point and added him. So actually the point here is there's a lot of data out there, but it's not particularly high assurance. And high assurance data is potentially worth something. People are willing, well, organizations who want information are willing to pay for that. So Ken Klingstein is doing some of this kind of work in the NSTIC program he's doing, and has been thinking about how we can monetize, a verb I hate, but there you go, monetize some of the information we might have. And specifically in the R&E sector, there are other things to be thinking about here. one of which is actually allowing people to do things anonymously has the potential to have real business benefits. The world of R&E is an increasingly competitive place and an increasingly commercial place. Maybe we don't want, maybe some of the academic institutions out there or the research organizations don't want the other organizations to know what their users are doing. If you can see the kind of journals they're looking at and the kind of websites they're logging into, you can infer their research directions. So actually, some of this is potentially very interesting information. So, anyway, we wanted to protect privacy wherever we can. Of course, what does that mean? What does privacy mean? Let's define some terms. Privacy is way too overloaded a term to actually talk about it in general. It means, it's one of those things, means all things to all people. So what I'm actually talking about today, more specifically, is in the world of access and identity management, we're talking about allowing anonymous access to resources, and where you can't be anonymous, only releasing personally identifiable information that's necessary and is minimized. So there are some good general privacy principles which we should be applying here. Things like privacy by design. Privacy is very hard to retrofit properly onto systems. Take a system that's been designed a long time ago, try to add privacy to it, doesn't work. Well, it might occasionally work, but by accident, not because of any foresight. The only way to do this is to take privacy into account when you're designing the system from the ground up. So 20, 30 years ago, we just designed, well, I didn't. I was a bit young at the time. 20, 30 years ago, we designed systems just thinking about the utility of the system. Then maybe 10, 20 years ago, we started thinking about adding security from the ground up. We're getting better at it. We're not there. Especially the last 10 years, starting to do this, adding security stuff in. Standards development bodies like the ITF have started, 15, 20 years ago, whatever. When you write new protocols, you have to have security considerations alongside them. Think about the security implications of the things you're making. Now, we're just getting to the point where privacy is coming in. We need to start thinking about privacy from the ground up when we're designing things. And again, standards development bodies are doing a similar thing. So there's now privacy considerations, things you can add into your standards as you're developing them. Privacy protection. Data protection doesn't equal privacy protection. EU privacy laws, so in the UK, obviously, or in the EU, are somewhat over-effective. When I say somewhat over-effective, I mean massively over-effective. It's good. It's a good principle to try to retain data protection, allow people to have access to their own data and delete data and not ship data where it's not going to be looked after properly. On the other hand, we're in a situation where the current EU privacy laws suggest that an IP address is personally identifiable information, and therefore routing information outside of, routing IP packets outside of the EU is breaking data protection law. That's a ridiculous situation to be in. So things are evolving there. The EU privacy laws are being rewritten, and sometimes they look like they're going the right way and sometimes they don't. Who knows where we'll end up. But we generally seem to be moving towards less of a black and white approach and more of a risk-based approach, which is the right way to be thinking about this. What does this mean? It means that there are many shades of gray, not just black and white. So we should be thinking about all the possible implications of what we're doing and not just thinking, right, if it meets data protection law, then it's good. If it doesn't meet it, it's bad, because neither of those are necessarily true. And that leads right on to kind of the final bit of it, which is the privacy versus utility. It's a constant battle, especially in the EU because of data protection laws. We are trying to protect individual privacy and organizational privacy, but we're also trying to retain the usefulness of what we're actually doing. Especially in the world of federated identity, there's this potential for a really rich system for authentication and authorization and passing information back and forth to each other. But on the other hand, that really could potentially be a massive privacy violation for our users if we're passing across social security numbers and things like that. So it's a fight between trust in the system and the privacy of the user. And finding that balance is very hard. There's no two ways around it. It's very hard. And it's we're going to find a line and it's going to shift constantly over time. And in fact, the answer will be very different for every single context. So there is no single answer, but as a privacy principle, you're not just trying to protect privacy, because the problem with protecting privacy to the ultimate degree, as we all know, is you get in the user's way, they will find a way around it. And they will just give all the information out themselves, because they don't quite realize what the implications of that are. So we need to find that balance of protecting privacy where we can, but also retaining the usefulness of what we're doing. So those are the kind of things we're trying to do, trying to protect privacy, but also keep things useful. So where are we now? So quick state of the union. We have, by and large, two different kinds of AIM services. There are some others, but these are the two main ones. We have web federations, so SAML federations, and we have network federations like Eduroam. In the SAML world, what do we have? So SAML world is web single sign-on. Allow users to access resources like e-journals, like web systems, like learning platforms, things like that. There are many of these research and education-based SAML federations in the world. Government federations, commercial users of this kind of paradigm, and many beyond. In the R&E space alone, if you want some NASCAR logo style things, these are a selection of the R&E federations that exist. Plenty of them. In Commons in there somewhere, in the middle, on the right. So, let's have a look at what these actually look like. You need to see what they look like to understand the privacy implications. So, SAML federations are made up of identity providers and relying parties or services. Identity providers being the entities that represent organizations that have users that want to log into things. Services being things like the VLE or an e-journal web, nature.com or whatever. There are two ways of deploying SAML federations. There's a mesh model whereby an IDP knows about every RP it's going to talk to and talks to them directly. So if one particular IDP wants to talk to another IDP, it talks to it directly. So you end up with a very complicated diagram where everything can talk to everything. From the federation operator point of view, and we operate the UK federation in the UK, obviously, it's the simpler way to deploy a SAML federation. And in Commons, the same way of doing this. It's the simpler way for the federation operator because there's nothing to actually run. There's no central point or anything. You just manage who is a member of the federation, and you manage, in the SAML case, SAML metadata. It's more complex on the edge, potentially, than the other way of doing it, which we'll look at in a minute, because every IDP needs to know about every RP, and vice versa. So you have this big SAML metadata file. The other way of doing it is called hub and spoke. So just squeeze those aside for a minute and stick a hub in the middle. You have, just as before, all the IDPs, all the relying parties, all the services in the world. Now, every IDP talks to the hub, and the hub talks to the RP. So there's this middle point where every communication flows through. Every IDP talks to one hub. The hub talks to every RP, every service. From the federation operator point of view, it's a bit more complex now because you have this thing to run in the middle. And if that goes down, the whole federation goes down. On the other hand, on the end points, it's a little bit simpler because now an IDP only needs to know about the one thing, the hub, and the services only need to know about the hub. So it's a bit simpler for customers deploying their end of things, maybe. So these two different ways of deploying things. There's no right way. Again, it's a utility question for the people running the federation and how much they want to run. Do they want these central points or not? But what are the privacy implications of these two things? Well, in the mesh world, the good points of the mesh world for privacy versus utility are the user can remain anonymous to the service. That is, a user goes to a service, logs in via their IDP. The IDP can just say, yes, I vouch for this person. They are a member of my organization. But they don't have to say any more. So you can have anonymous browsing on the service. IDPs can tailor attribute release to the service because it knows who the user is, it knows where they're going. So it can say, well, this service is allowed to see these attributes. This service is allowed to see these attributes. So we can let the IDP do some of the data minimization, so minimal disclosure, the principle of minimal disclosure. And the RP can receive pseudonymous identifiers from the IDP. So it can't link it directly back to a user, but they know it's the same user who came back last time. So you can do personalization of things, which is good. Bad things from a privacy perspective, the IDP can see what services the user is going to. The service can see what IDPs the users are coming from. In the R&E world, that might not be that much of a problem. But out beyond our space, it may be a problem. So the citizen space identity ecosystem. So over here in the US, the NSTIC work that's going on. Over in the UK, we're doing something very similar. Cabinet Office in the UK are building a SAML-based citizen identity ecosystem where a user can choose their IDP, and it's going to be things like banks and the post office and things like that. And all the services are going to be, government services. You log in to pay your taxes or whatever. This might be a problem. You might not want the IDP you're using to know which services you're logging into. You might not want to know that you're logging into, a health-based resource dealing with cancer or something. You might want to keep some privacy from that. And vice versa, you might not want the relying party to know where you're coming from, because that's an aspect of personal information, almost. It's a choice you made about which IDP to come from. So there are good points and bad points. The main things being that anonymity is easy in this sense, as in anonymity for the user from the service, and you can tailor this attribute release policy that personally identifiable information is not released unless you have to. And where it is, you only release it with specific purposes. Over in the hub and spoke world, things are a little bit different. There's now this extra bit, the hub. So as before, the user can remain anonymous to the service. The service doesn't have to know who the user is. But now, the IDP doesn't know what services the user is using. Good thing. The RP doesn't know which IDP the user came from. That's a good thing. So lots of good things. There's still traceability through the system. An RP can go to the hub, and which can go to the IDP and can find out which user the particular user was if there's been abuse. So lots of good things in the hub and spoke world, apart from one massive bad thing, which is the hub in the middle sees everything. So you have to trust the hub blindly. So this is called the double blind. Hub and spoke is the double blind. The IDP can't see the RP can't see the IDP, because there's this bit in the middle. So if you're setting up a SAML federation, you have this choice to make. Do you have the hub in the middle or not? If you do, everyone has to trust you. And speaking as a trust and identity professional, I don't trust anyone. So yeah, there are interesting things afoot. Triple blind techniques, meaning no single entity anywhere has the full picture, using cryptographic stuff. So the IDP doesn't know which RP the user is going to. The RP doesn't know which IDP they came from, and the hub can't tell either as well. But they start getting very complex, these solutions. I think the Canadian citizen space thing, which uses the banks, as IDPs, does a triple blind thing. So that's another option. Anyway, that's the SAML world. Two models of deploying things, each with their own kind of privacy and utility. Eduroam, slightly different. Eduroam is made up of organizations which have wireless networks. So in this little diagram on the slide, you have the bit in the middle, which is actually a radius server. So it's an IDP or a service, just like in the SAML world. And it's connected to many access points, like these little guys down here. And you have lots of these. You know, one for, in the Eduroam case, every university might have its own little enclave. And how Eduroam works is slightly different, typically. It's actually a hierarchical model. So instead of each service, where in this case the service is the thing you're trying to log into, the wireless network, and the IDP is your home IDP. They talk to each other not directly, like in the SAML world, or via a hub, because there is no hub. There's actually a hierarchy. So you might have all the US stuff connected to one top-level server, all the UK stuff to another server, and then those are connected via another server. So the query might, you know, I might come along and try to connect to the access point down in the bottom left of the diagram, and I say, right, I'm from Janet. Janet's over on the right. It says, right, I don't know where you are. I'm going to ask my next server up. And that says, oh, I don't know where they are either. I'll ask my next server up. And it says, oh, it's the UK. So we go to the UK server, and they say, oh, yeah, Janet. And it goes to Janet. And you end up traversing this hierarchy. And all of this stuff actually flows through every point in the hierarchy. There is a different way of doing Eduroam. You can do it in a mesh model using technology like RadSec and dynamic discovery. This hasn't been hugely well deployed so far. It's relatively new, and there are certain requirements like DNSSEC if you're going to secure this properly, which hasn't been very well deployed. So looking at the hierarchical Eduroam world, what does privacy look like? It's kind of similar to the SAML stuff, except, well, actually this is very similar. The user can remain anonymous to the service. You try to log into the wireless network. It goes back to the IDP and says, this person's trying to log in, and the IDP says, yeah, I know them, and that's it. You get access to the network. The service you're logging into can tell which IDP you came from, which is potentially a bad thing. The Eduroam hierarchy can see what's going on, potentially a bad thing, and the IDP can see where you're roaming to, which is potentially a bad thing. On the other hand, there's no personal information being passed across here because Eduroam doesn't need it. Because it's a very specific context that doesn't need personal information, actually it works pretty well. So that's the SAML world, that's the Eduroam world. So where are we going? Is this solved? Is everything fine? Well, no. In the world of SAML, if the ultimate goal is privacy protection for users, then we've achieved it, because that happens. The anonymous browsing thing works really well. The problem is it works too well. Many organizations, especially over in Europe because of our data protection laws, are very reluctant to release any kind of personal information. And so if you need access to things which do need to know an identity for you, so you know, if it's a wiki and you're supposed to have rights, access rights, and so the wiki administrator needs to know who you are so they can give you those access rights, for example, it's a problem. So privacy works really well, but we've really hindered the utility of this. So actually what we're doing in the SAML world is not trying to protect privacy more, we're actually trying to bump up the utility slightly, trying to shift the balance slightly more towards the utility. And we're doing a few little things. So over in the EU, we have a data protection code of conduct, for example, which is an attempt to increase the utility by helping IDPs be willing to release some attributes to services. What the data protection code of conduct is a way, so the EU data protection law has a thing in it which says specific communities, it can have a code of conduct, which means the data protection laws for that community can be slightly relaxed. So we've written the code of conduct. It means IDPs can be a bit happier releasing information to services because they know that that service has said that they will be abiding by data protection stuff without a specific contract being in place between the IDP and the service. So that's kind of being rolled out at the moment. We're doing things like entity categories where identity providers and service providers can be marked with little annotations, little flags that can say something about them. And these are things like, they're usually used to help things like influencing UI and importantly can help attribute release. So for example, we're rolling out something called the research and scholarship category, which InCommons had for a while, and we're trying to push out beyond InCommon, which is a way to help attribute release. Because the category basically says that this particular entity, its primary purpose is to help the research and scholarship world. It's not a commercial entity who might just go and suck all of your private information and sell it to someone. It's, you know, it's a wiki run by another university. It's a collaboration tool that researchers want to use. So it's a little flag saying that this particular entity might be slightly lower risk than normal and slightly higher value than normal. So just ways to help prod the identity provider operators and make them a bit more comfortable about releasing personally identifiable information. So SAML world is just these little minor tweaks to try to get this working. Eduroam actually works pretty well. There's not much to do. There's good levels of user privacy, and it works really nicely. There are some small tweaks we're doing to help things like traceability. So providing like a pseudonymous identifier. If you know the SAML world, it's like an eduperson targeted ID. We're adding that into the system, or have been for a while. Though there is a potential question that Eduroam, the utility might be starting to stretch a bit thin. It works quite nicely in the context we've been using it so far, but we've increasingly, in the UK and around Europe and in the US, there have been people asking, oh, can we use that? Things that people like schools and other government use cases. So the fire service in the UK has been playing with some of this. And so if you take schools as an example, schools in the UK typically offer a filtered internet service. It's not the whole internet, it's a very filtered version of it. If you do normal Eduroam and you deploy Eduroam into schools and you let the students use it, it means, you know, young children might be able to go to, when walking past the university, get online and get access to the whole internet. And schools don't actually like that idea. So they want a way of being able to say that we want a filtered feed to the internet. And of course, the rest of the Eduroam community doesn't really want to be doing this. So there are things we can be doing to enhance the utility potentially of Eduroam and the flexibility of it. And we're kind of looking at that at the moment. So that's SAML world, that's the Eduroam world. And the final world is the new world we're creating, the Moonshot world, which is, if you haven't heard of Moonshot, it's another federated access solution, different technology. It's actually a combination of technologies using EAP and RadSec, which is what Eduroam uses for authentication, SAML for authorization, and integration with applications using a GSS API. So essentially federated access for any kind of application. So an attempt to unify everything and end up with one technology which has the potential to do everything, though it's not going to replace everything. It's just going to sit alongside everything else. But it does things like federated access to SSH and federated access to potentially things like the Windows desktop, stuff like that, because it all integrates quite nicely. There's a pilot of this technology in the UK. It's been running since last April, ends at the end of this year. There's a European-wide Xeon pilot of this, which ends next March. And then we're going to be switching this to a real service for our users next year. So what does privacy in the Moonshot world look like? Well, actually, just like everything else, it depends how you deploy it. And the way we're imagining it's going to be deployed and where we're going to be deploying it is the mesh model. So it's the similar privacy things to the way the SAML mesh model works. But with a few little tweaks to try to carry on pushing the utility of things a little bit more. Because otherwise, we're going to have exactly the same problems the SAML world does. And to explain that, you need to understand how the Moonshot entities find each other, something called trust router. So in the SAML world, SAML metadata defines how people can find the other entities. In the Eduroam world, it goes through the hierarchy. Moonshot has none of these, so we have something called trust router, which is a way of letting Moonshot entities find other Moonshot entities. And it works it's a multi-layered trust network, essentially. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of the technology here, because we need another 2 or 3 hours or something. But what the trust router network does is, instead of being a flat network like SAML metadata or Eduroam, it's actually layered. There's a layer at the bottom where when you join the network, you join what we call the authentication policy community. Yeah, lots of words. And it's actually just validation of an organization. There are different ways you could deploy this. This is the way we're going to deploy it. So to get on the network, we check the organization is who they say they are. And that's it. Nothing else. So we don't have any guarantees of user behavior. We don't have anything like that. It's just purely, if you're talking to a Moonshot entity that says it's from a particular university, you know it's from that particular university. Then on top of that, we have communities. Communities can be set up by anyone, any person in the world. And each community is going to have these policies around user behavior. So registration levels of assurance, authentication levels of assurance, operational practices, behavior guarantees of the user, how quickly somebody's going to be deprovisioned if they leave, how hard you can hit them with a stick when they do something bad, that kind of thing. And attribute release. So you can say, if you create a community, you can say, actually, we really need this attribute. I'm only going to let you join if you do it. So kind of the stick approach for the identity provider administrator. So if you've got a whole trust network, we have lots of IDPs and lots of RPs connected via this trust router network. And note that the trust router network is just a way of entities finding each other. Once they've found each other, all communication is direct. So these aren't little hubs. So a particular community might be a subset of the whole trust network. A second community might be this other subset, and this third community might be this other subset. So we end up with this kind of world. So one of the things that is important in, say, the SAML world is this pseudonymous identifier that you can use to access things, to allow the user to get personalization, but still retain anonymity. That's through the use of the pseudonymous identifier. So we want to enable that. The other reason this is important is that federated authentication, I think pretty much everyone's bought into the concept now. It's a good thing. Federated authorization is another matter entirely. IDPs don't want to take responsibility for access control decisions to somebody else's resource in case of liability issues. Services don't want to delegate responsibility because they don't trust anyone. Why should someone else choose how people connect to my service? So what we actually want to do is enable pseudonymous federated authentication like we do in the SAML world, except a little bit better. The typical SAML deployment is kind of hampered a bit by the flatness of things. You have a pseudonymous identifier that's either different for every service you go to, or one, like eduperson principal name, which is the same for everyone. But Moonshot is a less flat network. We have these layers of community. So what can we do there to help with the utility privacy thing? So in the Moonshot world, you have these communities, and the community is made up of different realms. So Cardiff University might be one particular realm in there. Janet might be a particular realm. And in each realm, you have a set of IDPs and a set of services. So in this case, Cardiff and Janet have an IDP each and two services each. So just like in the SAML world, we have the RP-targeted pseudonymous identifiers, just like eduperson targeted ID. It's going to be different for every service a user logs into. Great. Anonymous browsing. This is what SAML does. It stops collusion between these services, so it helps enhance the privacy of the user, but doesn't allow account linking. One thing we've run into in the SAML world is a particular research project, for example, might want to say across multiple services, this is the same user. And the only way to do that really in the SAML world in any easy sense is by releasing a non-pseudonymous identifier to them all. So, you know, an actual, say, username or an email address or something. So we also have a realm targeted identifier, which is the IDP will release this particular identifier, and it's pseudonymous, but it'll be the same for every service within a realm. But across realms, it'll be different. Which means within a realm, you can link across RPs. And then, on top of that, we have a community-targeted identifier, which is a pseudonymous identifier, but would be the same for every service in every realm. So the point here is you might have, say, an e-science community who have lots of services across lots of different universities or whatever, and you can have a pseudonymous identifier that you can, across these services, know it's the same user. So enabling account linking, but in a way that users don't have to do something, which is the problem at the moment. SAML can do this, but you have to get the user to do something, and they don't understand what they're doing. And why should they have to? Of course, this means that IDPs are going to have to be set their policies to release these different levels of identifier because they are allowing collusion, which is potentially a bad thing. But the way you deal with that is when you create the community, if you need it, you put it in your policy and you say why it's important, and as a part of your own policy, you have stuff in your policy that deals with the data protection stuff, which is the main thing that stops IDPs from doing it in the first place. So if it's dealt with from the very start, then IDPs should be more willing to release stuff. Anyway, so a whistle-stop tour through privacy and the AIM services we're running. So SAML, good, but needs a bit of tweaking. Eduroam, good, but maybe starting to fray at the edges a bit. And Moonshot, stuff we're doing, you know, in the next year or so, new stuff that's coming along. So kind of the final words here are that what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Privacy is an important, fundamental human right. That's why we're doing this. Federated AIM services can help preserve this privacy. Every little helps. And when you're deploying stuff, carefully consider your deployment model because it might have lasting privacy implications that you can't change later. And that's me. So if anyone has any questions.
Hi. So my question is around the sort of possibility of backporting these ideas of communities with policies wrapped around them and shared pseudonymous identifiers embedded within the community to the SAML universe. Because it seems like that's an idea that was maybe built around the idea of virtual organizations and would be incredibly useful in the SAML federations as a way of mitigating the need to do things like entity categories. You know, if you've got a VO like LIGO or physics research or something, and you've got a common set of policy wrapped around that, then you can be confident that you can release a specific set of attributes just to that community. So.
Well, actually, you say that you would like the wider pseudonymous identifiers, but as maybe a way of not having to do entity categories. Entity categories may in fact be the way of doing this. You have an entity category which essentially has a number of entities that are part of it. That's the same as a community. And you could use that as one of the drivers, one of the inputs to a shared identifier across every entity in that particular entity category. So entity categories may well be the way to do this. So one of the inputs to this in the world of SAML. And it's certainly something we need to be looking at.
So you would add to the targeted ID triple, maybe make it a quadruple, and one of those is the entity category.
Well, to get technical, of course, there are, if the targeted ID you're creating is like a random UUID, then actually you're going to be doing policy releasing that particular UUID to different entities, but with the same entity category. If you're doing a SHA, you know, the hash-based one, and it's, yeah, the name of the entity category should be the input instead of the RP entity ID. But certainly something that's possible there, yeah. Any other questions, or does everyone just want to go to the bar now? Because I know I do. Nicole? You want to go to the bar? Okay. One vote for the bar. Okay, that's everyone. Thank you very much.